I was halfway across my porch when I saw her standing in my driveway, and everything around me seemed to slow down for a second. The summer heat had already turned the afternoon into something thick and heavy, the kind of day where even breathing felt like work, but she looked like she'd been fighting it and losing. Her hair was tied up in this messy knot that somehow made her look more beautiful, little strands sticking to the side of her neck where her skin glistened with sweat. She was fanning herself with one hand, cheeks flushed pink, her chest rising and falling just a little faster than normal. And when her eyes locked onto mine, I felt my feet stop moving without permission. I'm getting so hot, she said, breathless and direct, her voice carrying across the space between us like it was meant only for me to hear. My brain stuttered. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out because I had absolutely no idea what the right thing to say was in that moment. And the way she was looking at me with those wide, flushed eyes made thinking nearly impossible. The heat pressed down on both of us, and I could feel my heartbeat starting to thud louder in my chest while I stood there frozen like an idiot. Then she laughed, soft and light, tilting her head to the side in this way that made her whole face brighten. Relax, she said, grinning now. My car's AC died again. Relief hit me so hard I almost laughed out loud, but it came tangled up with embarrassment because, of course, that's what she meant, and I felt my face get warmer for reasons that had nothing to do with the weather. She must have noticed because her grin widened just a little, like she knew exactly where my mind had gone for those few seconds. Before we continue, please like this video, subscribe, and let me know where you are watching from. She reached into her pocket and tossed her keys toward me in this casual, playful arc. I caught them more out of reflex than skill. You're good with cars, right? She said, already turning toward the driveway where her car sat baking in the sun. Come on, show me what's wrong with it. I followed her without hesitation, and as we walked side by side toward her car, the summer air felt thicker and heavier than it had just moments before. Her car sat in the driveway, with the hood already propped open by the time we reached it, and the engine underneath looked like it had been baking under the sun for hours. I leaned over to get a better view of what we were dealing with, trying to remember everything I knew about air conditioning systems. But before I could even start to think clearly, she was right there next to me, close enough that I could smell whatever lotion or perfume she was wearing, mixed with the faint scent of summer sweat. She leaned in over the engine bay, like she was genuinely trying to see what I was looking at, her shoulder brushing against mine, and I had to force myself to focus on the tangle of belts and hoses in front of us, instead of how warm her skin felt through the thin fabric of her shirt. So, what do you think? She asked, her voice soft and curious, tilting her head like she was really waiting for my expert opinion. I cleared my throat and pointed toward the compressor, trying to sound like I knew what I was talking about. Could be the coolant level, or maybe the belt's loose. Sometimes it's just a blown fuse. She nodded slowly, eyes following my hand, but when I glanced sideways at her, I realized she was looking at my face instead of where I was pointing. Her lips curved into this small smile when our eyes met, and I felt heat crawl up the back of my neck that had nothing to do with the weather. Makes sense, she said, even though I was pretty sure she had no idea what I had just explained. I reached for my toolbox that I'd grabbed from the porch, flipping it open to find what I needed. She crouched down next to me, peering into the box like she wanted to help. What do you need? She asked, her fingers hovering over the scattered tools. The socket wrench, I said, scanning the mess of metal. She picked up a screwdriver and held it up with a playful grin. This one? That's a screwdriver. Right. She set it down and grabbed a pair of pliers, the twisty one. I couldn't help but smile. That's pliers. The wrench is the one with the flat thing. she interrupted, holding up a different tool entirely. I reached over and picked up the actual socket wrench, holding it up for her to see. This one. Oh, she laughed, and the sound was light and easy, like she wasn't even a little embarrassed about not knowing. Well, how was I supposed to know? When I took the wrench from my hand and passed it back to her, our fingers brushed together for just a second longer than necessary. She didn't pull away quickly, letting the touch linger, and I became hyper aware of every single point where our skin made contact. My pulse kicked up a notch, and I wondered if she could tell. I turned back to the engine, trying to shake off the distraction, and started checking the belt tension first because it was the easiest thing to rule out. The metal under my hands was hot from sitting in the sun, almost uncomfortable to touch, and I could already feel a thin layer of grease starting to coat my fingers as I worked. She stayed close the entire time, leaning over my shoulder, asking questions that felt more like excuses to keep talking than actual curiosity. Is it supposed to look like that? She'd say, or how do you even know where to start? And every time I tried to answer, I'd stumble over my words because I could feel her watching me instead of the engine. At one point, I needed to reach deeper into the engine bay to check a connection near the back, and she shifted to give me room, but somehow ended up even closer than before. Her arm pressed lightly against mine, and I could feel the warmth of her body radiating through the small gap between us. "You're really good at this," she said quietly. And when I glanced up, her face was only inches away. "I'm just checking a few things," I managed to say, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. She smiled, slow and knowing, like she could see right through me. Then she straightened up and lifted her hand to her neck, wiping away the thin sheen of sweat that had gathered there. The movement was slow, deliberate, her fingers trailing along her skin, and when she caught me watching, her smile widened just a little bit more. I dropped my gaze back to the engine, feeling my face flush and immediately fumbled with the wrench in my hand. It slipped from my grip and clattered loudly against the metal frame before falling onto the driveway with a sharp clang. She laughed, bright and unrestrained, and the sound made my embarrassment feel a little less terrible. "Smooth," she teased, bending down to pick up the wrench and handing it back to me. "Thanks," I muttered, taking it from her, and this time, when our fingers touched, I swore she let them linger even longer than before. I forced myself to focus on the task, testing the coolant levels and checking the fuses one by one. She stayed right there beside me the whole time, handing me tools when I asked, making jokes when I got frustrated, and every so often brushing against me in ways that felt too intentional to be accidental. By the time I'd narrowed down the problem to a likely blown fuse in the relay box, my hands were covered in grime and my shirt was sticking to my back. From the heat and exertion, she looked just as warm, just as flushed, but somehow she still seemed completely at ease, like she was exactly where she wanted to be. If you're enjoying this moment, like and subscribe, and drop a comment to tell me your favorite parts so far. The real problem turned out to be buried deeper in the engine than I'd expected, which meant I had to lean in until my whole upper body disappeared under the hood, reaching for components I could barely see. The metal was hot against my forearms, and sweat was already running down the back of my neck, but I kept working because stopping now would mean admitting I had no idea if I could actually fix this thing. I heard her footsteps move closer behind me, felt her presence before she said anything. "Here, let me help," she said, and suddenly she was right there next to me, leaning in with a flashlight she'd pulled from somewhere, angling the beam toward where my hands were working. Her shoulder pressed against mine, warm and solid, and I could smell something sweet mixing with the heat. Maybe her shampoo or just her. When I glanced sideways, her face was only inches from mine, close enough that I could see the tiny beads of sweat on her temple. and the way her lips were parted slightly as she focused the light. I tried to concentrate on the bolt I was loosening, but my hands felt clumsy now, too aware of how near she was standing. The engine compartment felt smaller with both of us crowded into it. Think you can handle it? She asked, her voice low and smooth. And even though she was clearly talking about the repair, something about the way she said it made my stomach tighten. Yeah, I've got it, I managed to say, though I wasn't sure I believed myself anymore. She shifted her weight, and her arm brushed against mine, just for a second, but it was enough to make me lose my grip on the wrench. The bolt slipped, and I cursed under my breath, frustrated at myself for being so distracted. She laughed softly, right near my ear, and her breath was warm against the side of my face. The sound of it did absolutely nothing to help me regain focus. I pulled back from the engine, needing a second to reset, and when I straightened up, she was already standing a few steps away with her arms crossed, watching me with this expression that looked way too amused. She wasn't even pretending to hide the fact that she was enjoying this, enjoying watching me struggle with the car, and maybe with her proximity too. What? I asked, reaching for a rag to wipe the grease off my hands. She just smiled wider, shaking her head like she knew something I didn't. Nothing, you're doing great. The way she said it made me feel like she meant something entirely different, but before I could think about it too much, she tilted her head and asked, "Need me to cool you down?" My brain went blank again for half a second, but then she was already reaching into her bag and pulling out a cold water bottle, holding it out toward me with that same knowing grin. I took it from her, our fingers brushing during the exchange, and I couldn't tell if she'd done that on purpose or if I was just imagining things now. Thanks, I said, twisting the cap off and taking a long drink. The cold water helped, but not as much as I needed it to. "Any time," she replied, leaning back against the side of her car with her arms crossed again, looking completely comfortable despite the heat. I turned back to the engine, determined to actually finish what I'd started, and bent down to peer inside again. This time I knew where the problem was, and my hands moved more confidently, reaching for the right parts without hesitation. I could feel her watching me, but I didn't look up, not yet, because I needed to prove to myself that I could actually do this without falling apart. I was tightening the last connection when she moved closer again, leaning in to see what I was doing. Her hand came to rest on the edge of the hood, right next to mine, so close that I could feel the heat radiating from her skin. I froze for just a moment, waiting to see if she'd move closer or pull away, but she did neither. Her hand just stayed there, hovering near mine, close enough that if either of us shifted even slightly, we'd be touching. The silence stretched out between us, heavy and charged, and I found myself holding my breath without meaning to. I could hear her breathing too, steady and calm, while my own heart was doing something erratic in my chest. Then, just when I thought she might close that last bit of distance, she pulled her hand back and straightened up, breaking the moment as casually as if it had never happened. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding and forced myself to finish tightening the connection. When I finally stood up and turned to face her, she was already looking at me, her eyes steady and unreadable. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. We just stood there in the heat, staring at each other while the world around us seemed to fade into the background. I should have looked away first. That would have been the smart thing to do, the safe thing, but I didn't. I kept my eyes on hers and she kept hers on mine. And the longer it went on, the harder it became to remember why I was supposed to be pretending this was just about a broken air conditioner. Her expression shifted slightly, something softer moving across her face, but before I could figure out what it meant, she smiled again, that same playful smile from before. "So," she said, breaking the silence finally, "is it fixed?" I blinked, pulling myself back into the present.
Let me check the fuse box, I said, my voice coming out rougher than I'd intended. It might be something electrical. She nodded and stepped aside to let me move past her, but as I walked toward the driver's side door, I felt her eyes following me, tracking my every movement. I opened the door and leaned in to check the fuses, grateful for a moment where I didn't have to look at her directly, where I could pretend I was still in control of the situation.
But I could still feel her standing just behind me, close enough that if I leaned back even slightly, I'd bump into her. Every nerve in my body was aware of exactly where she was, how near, how warm the air felt in the small space between us. I found the blown fuse quickly, replaced it with a spare from the kit under her seat, and straightened up to test the system. When I turned the key in the ignition, the engine hummed to life and cold air started pouring from the vents. Relief mixed with something else I couldn't quite name flooded through me. There it is, I said, turning to look at her. She was smiling now, genuinely happy, and she moved closer to feel the cold air coming from the vents with her own hand. You actually did it, she said, sounding impressed and maybe a little surprised. Told you I could handle it, I replied, and this time when I said it, it felt like I meant more than just the car. Her eyes met mine again, and something passed between us, something that made the already warm afternoon feel even hotter despite the cold air now blasting from her dashboard. Like this, if you feel the tension, subscribe and tell me what you do in this moment. We both stepped back from the car at the same time, and I noticed we were both breathing a little harder than we should have been. Maybe it was the heat that had been beating down on us all afternoon, or maybe it was everything else that had been building between us while I worked. Either way, the space between us felt different now, less charged with playful tension and more filled with something quieter, something I couldn't quite name yet. She leaned back against the side of her car, and when she looked at me this time, her expression had changed. The teasing glint in her eyes had softened into something more genuine, more open. She looked at me like she was actually seeing me, not just playing the game and we'd been dancing around since she'd shown up in my driveway. You didn't have to do this, she said quietly, her voice lacking the playful edge it had carried before. I shrugged and wiped my hands on the rag again, even though they were already as clean as they were going to get. Couldn't let you melt out here, I said, keeping my tone light, because I didn't know how else to respond to the shift I felt happening between us. She smiled, but this time it was completely different from all the other smiles she'd given me today. This one was warm and grateful, and maybe a little vulnerable, like she'd let down some kind of guard she'd been holding up. It made my chest feel tight in a way that had nothing to do with the heat or the work I'd just finished.
The engine kept running behind us, pumping cold air into the cabin through the open door, and for a while, neither of us said anything. We just stood there in the driveway while the afternoon sun continued to pour down around us. But the silence between us felt comfortable now, not awkward or filled with unspoken tension. It felt like we'd crossed some invisible line and ended up somewhere calmer on the other side. I watched her face as she looked down at her feet, then back up at me, and I realized that maybe this whole thing had never really been about the car at all. Maybe she could have called a mechanic or asked someone else for help, but she'd come to me instead, had stood there in my driveway looking flushed and beautiful, and asked me specifically to come fix her problem. The thought settled in my mind slowly, reshaping everything that had happened over the past hour into something that felt more intentional, more meaningful. She pushed off from the car and took a small step toward me, closing the distance between us until she was near enough to reach out. Her hand came up slowly, and her fingers touched my forearm, right where a smear of grease still marked my skin. She brushed at it gently, her touch soft and deliberate, and even though she was supposedly just cleaning me off, her hand stayed there longer than it needed to. Her fingers were cool against my warm skin, and I felt the contact all the way up my arm, felt it settle somewhere deep in my chest. "You've got grease everywhere," she said softly, but she didn't stop touching me. "Hazard of the job," I replied, my voice coming out quieter than I'd intended. Her fingers traced a slow path along my forearm, not really cleaning anything anymore, just touching me because she could, because we'd somehow arrived at a place where that felt natural. I stood very still, afraid that if I moved too suddenly, I'd break whatever delicate thing was forming between us. Her hand was small and warm against my skin, and when she finally pulled it away, I felt the absence of her touch like a loss. She looked up at me, and I looked down at her, and in that moment, I understood that everything had shifted. We weren't neighbors flirting over a broken air conditioner anymore. We were two people standing in a driveway in the middle of summer, recognizing something real in each other, something that went beyond playful banter and charged glances. "I'm glad you were home," she said, and there was no double meaning in her words this time, no hidden tease waiting to surface. She just meant it, simple and honest. "Me too," I said, and I meant it just as much. The sound of the engine humming filled the quiet between us, a steady background rhythm that felt almost soothing now. Cold air continued to pour from the vents into the heated afternoon, doing its job finally, but neither of us moved to turn it off or close the door. We just stood there, close enough to touch but not touching, letting the moment stretch out as
long as it wanted to. I could see the way the sunlight caught in her hair, could see the faint freckles across her nose that I hadn't noticed before, could see the way her expression had gone soft and open in a way that made her look even more beautiful than she had when she'd been teasing me earlier. Everything about her seemed different now, more real, more present, and I found myself wanting to memorize the way she looked standing there in front of me. She reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a small gesture that felt intimate somehow, like I was being allowed to witness something private. When her hand dropped back to her side, her fingers brushed against mine for just a second, barely a touch at all, but enough to send warmth spreading through me. "Thank you," she said, and the sincerity in her voice made me realize how much she'd needed this. Not just the fixed air conditioner, but maybe the company, the conversation, the connection we'd stumbled into while our hands had worked together under her hood. "Anytime," I said, and I meant that too. She smiled again, that soft, vulnerable smile that was becoming my favorite expression of hers, and in the comfortable silence that followed, I felt something settle between us, something that felt like the beginning of everything. If you've ever felt this kind of connection, tap like and share your favorite moment below. She reached for the driver's side door and pulled it open wider, letting the cold air spill out into the heat around us. The blast of cool air felt incredible after spending so long bent over the hot engine, and I saw her close her eyes for a second, just appreciating the sensation of it washing over her flushed skin. "Want to test it with me?" she asked, looking back at me with a smile that had lost none of its warmth from moments before. She gestured toward the passenger seat. "Make sure it's really working." I didn't hesitate. "Yeah, sure," I said, already moving around the front of the car. She slid into the driver's seat, and I opened the passenger door, dropping into the seat beside her. The moment I closed the door behind me, sealing us both inside the cabin, the temperature difference hit me full force. After the oppressive heat of the afternoon, the cold air blasting from the vents felt almost surreal, like stepping into a different season entirely. The windows were still up, and the space suddenly felt smaller, more intimate, just the two of us enclosed in this cool bubble while the summer raged outside. She laughed, reaching forward to adjust one of the vents so it pointed directly at her face. And I found myself laughing too, because there was something absurd about how good this felt, how relieved we both were over something as simple as functioning air conditioning. Her hair lifted slightly in the stream of cold air, and she tilted her head back against the headrest, eyes closed again, just savoring it.
This is incredible, she said, still smiling. I forgot what cold air felt like. You're welcome, I replied, grinning at her obvious relief. She opened her eyes and turned her head to look at me, her smile softening into something more personal. We sat there for a moment, just looking at each other in the cool dimness of the car interior, and I became acutely aware of how close we were sitting, how the console between us was the only thing separating us, how her knee was almost touching mine. Guess I don't need to worry about getting hot anymore, she said, her voice carrying a trace of her earlier playfulness, but gentler now, more knowing. I felt my grin widen because I knew exactly what I wanted to say, knew it was probably bold, but felt right anyway. Pretty sure that's still happening, I said, holding her gaze. Her expression shifted in an instant, surprise flickering across her features first, before something bolder took its place, something that made her eyes brighten and her lips part slightly. She stared at me for a long moment, like she was trying to figure out if I really meant what I thought I meant, and I watched the realization settle over her face. You think so? She asked, her voice dropping lower, and this time there was no ambiguity in the question, no innocent interpretation hiding behind it. Instead of answering with words, I leaned toward her across the console, moving slowly enough that she had every chance to pull back if she wanted to, but she didn't pull back. She leaned forward to meet me halfway, her hand coming up to rest on the console between us, and I noticed the way her breathing had changed, the way her eyes had gone soft and focused entirely on me. The space between us closed gradually, neither of us rushing, neither of us desperate or frantic. This felt steady and intentional, like we both knew exactly what we were doing and wanted to savor every second of it. I could feel the cold air still blasting around us, but all I could focus on was the warmth radiating from her, the way her face was tilted up toward mine, the way her eyes fluttered closed just before our lips met. The kiss was soft, gentler than I'd expected, and it sent warmth flooding through my entire body, despite the cold air surrounding us. Her lips were warm and moved against mine with a tenderness that made my chest ache, and I felt her hand shift on the console, her fingers finding mine and threading through them. I kissed her carefully, like she was something precious I didn't want to break, and she kissed me back with the same gentle intention, no urgency or demand, just genuine connection.
When we finally pulled back, it was only by inches, and I opened my eyes to find her already looking at me. She was still smiling, this beautiful, radiant smile that lit up her whole face, and I knew I was smiling too. Couldn't have stopped myself if I'd tried. We stayed there, foreheads almost touching, breathing the same cool air, our hands still linked on the console between us. Maybe I should break my AC more often, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the air still rushing from the vents. I laughed softly, the sound coming out a little breathless. I'd be okay with that, I said, squeezing her hand gently. She bit her lip, still smiling, and I watched her eyes search my face like she was trying to memorize this moment, commit every detail to memory. The way she was looking at me made me feel like I was the only person in the world that mattered to her right now, and the intensity of that feeling was almost overwhelming. I'm really glad I came over today, she said after a moment, her thumb tracing small circles on the back of my hand. Me too, I said, meaning it with everything I had. She leaned back slightly in her seat, but didn't let go of my hand. and I settled back into the passenger seat, our fingers still intertwined on the console. The cold air continued to blast around us, doing its job perfectly now, but neither of us made any move to turn it down or get out of the car. We just sat there together, hands linked, smiles still playing on both our faces, letting the reality of what had just happened settle over us. I looked at her profile as she stared out the windshield, watching the heat waves shimmer above the pavement beyond, and I realized with sudden clarity that she'd known exactly what she was doing when she'd shown up in my driveway earlier. She'd wanted a reason to see me, to spend time with me, to create a situation where we'd be close and working together. The broken air conditioner had been real, but it had also been an opportunity, one she'd seized deliberately. "You could have called a mechanic," I said quietly, voicing the thought that had been forming in my mind. She turned to look at me, her smile turning a little sheepish, but no less genuine. "I could have," she agreed, "but where's the fun in that?" "So, this was all part of your master plan?" I asked, unable to keep the amusement out of my voice. "Not all of it," she admitted, her cheeks flushing slightly. "The AC really did break. But when it happened, I might have thought it was a good excuse to come see you." "I'm glad you did," I said, squeezing her hand again.
Me too, she whispered. We sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, neither of us in any hurry to leave the cool sanctuary of her car or to let go of each other's hands. The afternoon sun continued to beat down outside, but inside we were cool and comfortable and together, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt this content, this sure about something. Eventually, she laughed softly, shaking her head. "We should probably get out before we freeze to death in here," she said, though she made no move to actually leave. "Probably," I agreed, but I didn't move either. She turned to face me more fully, her expression serious now, despite the smile still lingering on her lips. "I really do appreciate you fixing this for me," she said, "but more than that, I appreciate you giving me a reason to finally do something about this." "About what?" I asked, though I thought I might already know. "About us," she said simply. "About whatever this is between us. I've been wanting to for a while." Her honesty took my breath away for a second. "Me too," I admitted. "I just didn't know if you felt the same way." "I do," she said, and the certainty in her voice left no room for doubt. "I really do." I brought our joined hands up and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, watching her eyes soften at the gesture. "Then I'm really glad your AC broke," I said. She laughed, the sound bright and happy in the enclosed space. "Best mechanical failure I've ever had," she agreed. We finally, reluctantly, let go of each other's hands and opened our doors, stepping back out into the wall of heat that hit us immediately. But it felt different now, less oppressive and more alive, charged with possibility. She came around to my side of the car and stood close to me, looking up with those same warm eyes that had been teasing me just an hour ago, but now held nothing but genuine affection. "So," she said, her voice taking on a playful lilt, "when can I see you again?" I smiled down at her, feeling lighter than I had in months. "Whenever you want," I said, "is broken car optional?" She grinned. "Good to know." We lingered by her car for another moment, neither of us quite ready to let the afternoon end, and she glanced back at the open driver's side door where cold air was still pouring out into the heat. "One more minute?" she asked, tilting her head toward the interior with a grin. "Yeah," I said, following her lead as we both slipped back into our seats. The cool air wrapped around us again, and she let out a contented sigh, resting her head back against the seat. She turned to look at me, her expression relaxed and happy, and I felt something warm settle in my chest at the sight of her like this, comfortable and close. "You know, you're better at this than I thought," she said, her voice carrying that teasing lilt I was starting to love. I raised an eyebrow, playing along. "At fixing cars." She grinned. shaking her head slowly at everything else. The way she said it made my heart pick up speed again, and I couldn't help but smile back at her. Her hand moved across the console between us, fingers seeking mine. And when they found them, she laced our fingers together naturally, like it was something we'd been doing for years instead of minutes. I squeezed her hand gently and she squeezed back. And we sat there in the humming quiet of her car, just existing together without needing to fill the silence with words. Eventually, though, the world outside called us back. She gave my hand one last squeeze before letting go and reaching for her door handle. Guess we should probably face the heat again, she said, though she sounded reluctant. We stepped out into the afternoon sun, and the temperature hit me immediately, but somehow it felt different than it had earlier. The oppressive weight of it had lifted, replaced by something that felt more alive, more full of energy and possibility. She closed her door and walked around the front of the car to where I stood, and without hesitation, she reached for my hand again, threading her fingers through mine. Walk me back? She asked, even though my porch was only about 20 feet away. Of course, I said, and we started walking slowly across the driveway together. The heat pressed down on both of us, but I barely noticed it now, too focused on the feeling of her hand in mine, the way our steps matched pace naturally, the comfortable ease that had settled between us. When we reached my porch steps, she stopped and turned to face me, still holding my hand, looking up at me with those eyes that had started all of this with a single teasing line. Same time next week? She asked, her mouth quirking up at the corner. My brakes might need checking.
I laughed, shaking my head. Your brakes are fine, I said, calling out her excuse before she could even pretend it was real. She shrugged, completely unbothered at being caught. Guess you'll have to find another excuse to come over then, she said, her smile widening into something bright and full of promise. I don't think I need an excuse anymore, I replied, squeezing her hand. Good, she said softly, because I don't want you to need one. She stepped closer and rose up on her toes to press a quick, sweet kiss to my cheek, then pulled back before I could react. Thank you for today, she said, her voice sincere, for all of it. Any time, I managed to say, still processing the warmth of her lips against my skin. She gave my hand one final squeeze, then slowly let go, her fingers trailing across my palm as she stepped back. I'll see you soon, she said, already moving toward her car, but walking backward so she could keep looking at me. Yeah, I said, watching her go. Real soon. She turned around and headed back to her car, and I stood on my porch watching her slide into the driver's seat. She waved at me through the windshield, that brilliant smile still on her face, before starting the engine. The AC was working perfectly now, and I could see the relief on her face as the cold air hit her. She backed out of my driveway slowly, giving me one last look before driving away down the street. I stood there long after her car disappeared around the corner, my hand still warm from holding hers, my cheek still tingling from where she'd kissed it. The afternoon sun beat down on my shoulders and the heat surrounded me completely, but I felt none of the discomfort from earlier. Everything felt different now, charged with something new and exciting and full of potential. The summer heat would keep coming day after day, but I found myself hoping her car would need fixing again soon, or that she'd invent some other reason to show up in my driveway with that teasing smile and those bright eyes, though something told me she wouldn't need a reason anymore, and neither would I. Whatever this was between us, it had started today, and I couldn't wait to see where it went. Like this video, subscribe, and let me know, what would your excuse be to spend more time with someone you like? I'd really appreciate it if you could share your thoughts about my videos in the comments. Your feedback helps me improve and create even better content for you. Thank you.